Today is the 27th of November, 2024. My name is Bea Lefkowitz. I'm the director of the AJR Refugee Voices Archive and also the lead on the Holocaust Testimony UK portal. This is the series of Archives in Conversation, and we're very happy to welcome Christine Schmidt from the Wiener Library, Dr. Christine Schmidt from the Wiener Library, um, to this conversation. Good morning, Christine. Christine, can you tell
Thanks,
us,
Pale. Thanks. Good morning.
well,
Good morning.
good
Thank you
morning.
for having me.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, of course, that we're very grateful for your cooperation in the portal, and that at the moment, I think I checked, there's 101 interviews listed on the Wiener site on the portal, and we'll talk about those interviews a little bit later. But maybe just tell me, because the Wiener was so important in terms of testimony collection, not necessarily recorded testimony, but other testimonies. I think it's important to talk about it. So if you could just tell us a little bit about the early testimony collection which took place at the Wiener Library.
Sure. Thanks again for having me, and congratulations on the launch of the testimonies portal. It looks fantastic. Yeah, so a bit about the library's relationship to recording eyewitness accounts, as they were called at the time. It derived from as people may know, that the library is one of the oldest continuing institutions collecting evidence of the Holocaust and persecution of Jews during the Holocaust, and it derives from the name derives from its founder, Alfred Wiener, who was a German Jewish scholar who, when he returned from fighting in World War One, he noticed this alarming rise in anti-Semitism in Germany and wanted to do something about it, so began to collect information and disseminate information. So really the recording of eyewitness accounts came from these very early efforts to ensure that evidence was collected, evidence of persecution, and information, reliable information, was disseminated. So the predecessor of the library was the Jewish Central Information Office, which was first founded in Amsterdam, which is where Alfred Wiener and his family had to flee, of course, because his activities and the activities of his colleagues were putting him and his family in life danger. So first they fled to Amsterdam, and then from Amsterdam, he continued his efforts to collect information about what the Nazis and their allies were doing. And this actually coincided with the Kristallnacht, or November pogrom, and which happened in November of 1938, of course. And at this time, the JCIO colleagues began to collect information about what people had seen and what they had experienced during Kristallnacht. And this amounted to, I think, a little bit more than 300 accounts, and some of them are anonymized, which was quite necessary because of the situation. People were still in danger. And so you can see this urgency of collecting very basic information about how these events unfolded in these testimonies. And these are all online at the library's website. These are not necessarily incorporated into the portal yet because they are not audiovisual. These are written reports. So a little different from the
Yeah,
testimony
but
portal.
really an effort
And
to gather the
the
evidence.
libraries, yeah,
Sorry, go on.
exactly, to gather the evidence. Yeah, to gather the evidence of what was happening. And like I said, a lot of these are anonymized because of the urgency of that situation. And then the library's work, of course, continued. And just before the outbreak of the war, Wiener and some of the JCI colleagues left for Britain, and it's been in London ever since 1939, and we are still in continuous operation. And the recording of eyewitness accounts continued. At the end of the war, they published survivor reports. These were some of the first testimonies that were published, written testimonies.
Yeah.
And then these efforts continued in the 1950s because they had funding from the Claims Conference and were in partnership with Yad Vashem to record eyewitness accounts. So this project is a kind of an outgrowth of the tradition of recording eyewitness accounts to establish a base of evidence. And this project in the 1950s was led by the library's first director of research, Dr. Eva Reichman. And these recordings are really, again, written reports based on interviews. So unfortunately, we don't have the original interviews. There were no recordings, but
Shame.
each of the interviews in this collection, I know, it's really, and actually what we don't have also is the questions that the interviewers asked.
They didn't keep the
But what's
question.
interesting about this collection, no, no. And what's interesting about this collection is that the interviewers themselves were many times, many former German Jewish or German speaking Jewish refugees, or other survivors of the Holocaust, and they were interviewing other survivors. So what you can see in this collection is almost mini collections within. So one interviewer will do their interviews in a certain way, and you can find out the kind of relationships between the interviewer and the interviewees. Also, from an extensive collection of correspondence that we have about this collection and about how it came to be. So, one of the things that I know when we study testimonies, we're very interested in those conversations that happen off camera as well, and
Yeah.
why an institution has recorded these accounts. And so that's what's also interesting about this collection, even though it's sadly not an audio visual
And
collection.
Christine, how many are there? How many
The
are there in this in the Reichmann collection? How
oh,
many?
in the Reichman collection, there are I think about a little over 1,000, so about 1,300 accounts. Now, these also constitute, so they're not necessarily traditional, kind of eyewitness accounts in the sense that sometimes people submitted poetry or they submitted songs or they submitted letters as their testimony. So this includes those types of reports that were not, that weren't generated from interviews.
Mm. And Christine, can I ask you, because I think this is really important as a sort of prequel to the recorded testimony, who was included? For example, did they include at the time
Mm.
kinder transportees, or was it mostly survivors? Or can you see, is there, who was included in this at the time? Who did they think they should interview?
Mm. It's a good question. It's anyone who was persecuted by the Nazis, so it doesn't only include Jewish victims as well. So we have some accounts by Roma and Sinti survivors of persecution, and then we also have people who were, for example, were persecuted as Jews but had converted. So there are lots of discussions of quote unquote mixed marriages, privilege, in the sense that the Nazis defined it. And things like that. But in terms of age, that's an interesting question, because there were some reports that were done about child survivors who came to Britain after the Holocaust.
Mm.
But in the main, these accounts are with people who were adults at the time or older people. So this is something that's a bit lost in later testimony projects, because the passage of time did not allow for the
Sure.
recording of older people. So it's interesting because it's positioned a bit later than some of the early testimony projects of like 1945, 1946, like David Boder, who was recording accounts in the displaced persons camps. So it's about 10 years later after some of these
Yeah.
early,
And
early commissions were doing their work. But it's interesting for that who was included at this time and who was seen as a survivor. So it includes both refugees and survivors in this
it does
collection.
include it does include the refugees, which is
Yes,
interesting.
definitely,
So
definitely.
close to the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. No, I think, the fact that you say they're called eyewitness accounts. So, this brings me back. I talked with Stephen Naran about this, whether this notion of testimony, when that emerged, and the notion of video testimony, especially. And of
Mm.
course, those are eyewitness accounts. So this terminology at the time, as you said, was eyewitness accounts and not testimony. And I just wonder whether you
Right.
you want to comment on when that changed, um, whether
Mm.
it's apparent in your collection at all.
It's interesting because I think, like I said, the Reichman and colleagues were obviously not using that word testimony, and this happened before the Eichmann trial. So when that sort of, that definition, that kind of traditional definition of testimony became, I think, much more well known and much more widely used in also these projects to record survivor accounts, weren't happening until like the 80s, right? Or the 80s and the 90s. So
Yeah, late
the kind of
70s.
shift
Yeah.
in, yeah, and kind of the shift in why institutions were recording that. So I think it's a combination of who was doing the recording and who was listening, and the purposes changing for why survivors were giving their accounts. So this definitely was referred to as, we often refer to it as EWAs in
Oh,
shorthand at the library
yeah.
and in some of my writing. And because that's what she called them, that's what but we often, then kind of couch them in terms of, and actually refer to them as testimonies, because in contemporary parlance, that's
Yeah,
how people would see them.
of course, of course.
And so it's a kind of a mixture. So the interesting thing about these accounts now, as I said, these are not in your testimony portal yet, or not there now, because they are not audio visual, but they are living in a separate digital resource that you can access through the library's materials, called Testifying to the Truth. And you'll see on that website that we use those terms interchangeably. And this is partly because we want people to understand that you should see these in a kind of a continuum of the historical development of survivors speaking about their experiences.
Okay.
It's very different, but there's also trends that you can see.
Absolutely. No, I think it hopefully maybe somebody will come through the portal to the recorded testimonies and then maybe to the early testimonies. That's why I thought we should talk about this
Yes,
because for me, the parallel is, so you said, in the 50s, and then most video testimonies started in the 70s. But the similarity is that the Fortune of Archive was started by survivors as well, so that it was really memory
exactly.
work on the part of survivors and refugees starting these projects. And I think that's really interesting. And in a way, that's where I see the parallel. So Christine, so tell us then a little bit
Yeah,
about
definitely. I agree.
sorry,
I was
about
just saying,
I
I
think there's a
agree as well,
time lag.
because she also, there's a time lag.
There's a
Sorry.
time lag. So
No,
I don't
just
know.
to say,
We need to, I don't know, it must be the internet connection. Nothing we can do about it. Yes, sorry, you wanted to respond.
that the same, in addition to creating this evidence and finding these kind of gaps in the evidence, Reichman was definitely, she highly valued this contribution from refugees and survivors interviewing others, because she understood that they would understand these experiences best. And she also, saw it as an act of commemoration. So there's some interesting
Yeah.
writing that she did, for example, for the AJR information, the precursor to the journal, where she talked about these as kind of sites of memory. So it's a very similar project. It just happened a
Really
bit
interesting.
earlier than the Fortunoff. Yeah,
Yeah, and I saw that Eva Reichmann also, the announcement of the project was in the AGR information as well. So again, it shows
exactly,
this kind
exactly.
of close connection between the refugee survivor community and the project, which is,
Yeah, absolutely.
which is interesting. And I just wonder, as you said, there was also poetry and other things. Of
Mm,
course, there was sort of evidence gathering, which was also there at, when the interviews were done, and that's an important part of it.
mm.
But I wonder in terms of approach, how, that developed and how you see that in terms of the early 50s and then the early video interviews.
Mm. That's a good question, because I think for those of us who look at these accounts, having grown up potentially or through our education, becoming used to the way audiovisual testimonies are recorded, might find them a bit jarring, maybe, or like, oh, this is interesting, because especially if you look at our correspondence that is associated with this collection. Um, what was happening is that, for example, in many of the collections, we still retain this correspondence where we have it, and there's a lot of discussion about what is accurate and what needs to be deleted and what is included and what shouldn't be included. And so there's a lot of discussion offline, let's say, about what should be in this testimony to make sure that this person is seen as a reliable witness. So this is again before the age of the witness. This is before survivors were seen as authorities, and could be called upon for reliable information. There's this, you can kind of see this bias of, understanding that there's going to be this potential bias, that survivors are somehow, like, memory is faulty, can't be reliable as sources. So you can see a lot of back and forth, and it's perhaps a bit jarring to see handwritten, sort of crossing out on the reports themselves. This is this, the annexation of the Sudetenland did not happen in this year, it happened in this year. And so Reichmann crosses it out. And we have retained those crosses and,
Wonderful.
those corrections, and we see it. Yeah. And it's great because you see that iterative process in the material of, aspect of the reports.
But Christine, it makes sense because at the time they might have thought that might be used in a court or legal cases, for the future.
Exactly.
So that was the focus.
Exactly.
While of course that sort
E-
of shifted later. Um,
exactly.
and I guess that's if I heard some of the recordings of the 61, some of the trials, and the way the survivors were spoken to is just unbelievable from today's perspective by the
Yes.
judges. Yeah. Anyway,
Yes.
let's move on to the audio visual
It's a
recording.
similar phenomenon. Yes.
Yeah. Christine, so tell us a
It's a
little bit,
similar phenomenon. So you see that.
if you could tell us a little bit about the audiovisual recordings you have and which are accessible. They're not quite accessible on the portal. It gets to you, and I guess then people have to come to you or register with you. But they're all listed. We have about 101 interviews listed. So maybe just tell us about
Mm.
whether this is one collection or different collections or how those came about.
Like you said, going into what's in the portal, we have our collections of audiovisual testimonies, and of course, at the library, we also have access to the AJR Refugee Voices, but those are separate from what's been contributed to the portal from the library. So we have a few collections there, which you, again, as you said, can access when you come to the library's reading room. We have the Leo Beck London Lodge interviews, which we received after their activities they were wound down in 2017, 2018. The Leo Beck London Lodge was part of B'nai B'rith, which
Yeah.
is one of the world's oldest Jewish service organizations. And this was, again, a kind of a focus or a locus of activity of German-speaking Jewish refugees. But there were also other survivors who became involved in the Leo Beck London Lodge's activities. And then I think it was in the early 2000s where the men's and the women's lodges kind of combined. And so Alfred Wiener was a member of the men's lodge. And what we received were a lot of the material from the women's lodge and their interviews, which have summaries and biographies and audio tapes with women members. And I think these were taken in the 1990s. So these are not every biography has an interview, but it's a really interesting collection. We also have in the portal the interviews that Theo Richman did for his book Conan, A Quest. So he was a descendant of survivors of the Conan village in Poland. And these interviews were those that he conducted as part of the research for his really phenomenal book on Conan. And what's interesting about these is that these are not necessarily these were not interviews that were taken as in a kind of traditional oral history
Right.
format. These were obviously for his book. So there's a lot of like conversations, a lot of interruptions, lots of laughter, lots of dialogue involved in these. So these are really interesting as well. And you can get to this collection via the portal, then obviously connecting to us.
Yeah.
And I think these were donated to us in 2012. And there's over 200 hours of content on these interviews. And the languages are really like spanning there. Some of them are in Yiddish, some of them are in French and Hebrew. So Theo Richman has a wonderful command of language in these. So I think he did these, must have been in the late 80s, early 90s, but we might have to check to see about when they were recorded because his book was published in 1995. And then another collection that's in the testimony portal, which is also copied in other places, is the interviews that were done with the so-called secret listeners. So these were German Jewish refugees who came, who had fled Nazi Germany and came to Britain, and then they were used by the British government to spy on Nazi prisoners and held at POW camps. And there was a theater company named the Pascal Theater Company that had Heritage Lottery funding in 2012 to take on this Secret Listeners project. And so there was a site-specific play held at Trent Park, and then as part of this project, they recorded interviews with former secret listeners.
Yeah.
And like I said, these are copied at the British Library as well, and the I think at the Jewish Military Museum.
So Fritz
And they have
Lustig,
summaries
is
and
it?
transcripts.
Christine, Fritz Lustig is part of that collection, isn't it? Yeah. So is it because you say they're copies
Yes,
held
yes,
elsewhere,
exactly, exactly.
Christine? So because we have this, so at the
Mm,
moment, the Fortune of Archives and the British Library, they hold the same interviews with the shared copyright. So at the moment, they actually appear on the portal twice, although it's the same interview.
twice.
So I wonder whether that's the case for some of your interviews as well. That are
It could be the case with these in particular, because I
right.
think because of the HLF funding, maybe they had to deposit it and and have as many access points as possible. But we could check that to be
Yeah.
sure. But yeah, that might be a point of confusion for users when they come into the portal and
Yeah.
think it. But
They'll
what's
work it out.
interesting is when the same person has been. Yes, they will. And what's interesting is when the same person has been interviewed for multiple projects. So that's one of the things I think that the portal will facilitate that research.
I think this
And
is
then
the,
finally,
yeah, go on.
and then finally, we have a collection of 15 interviews that were actually done by the library itself, by our former education director, Catherine Klinger, with the the boys who were actually girls. So we know this story of the child Holocaust survivors who came to Britain, some a little over 800 of them, and they are collectively known as the boys, but in actuality, they included several girls. And so we have a collection of about 15 interviews. And these are interesting because they focus on life after and, sort of coming into adulthood after experiencing the traumas of the Holocaust. So these were recorded in, I think, the early 2000s. By Catherine, and they sort of flesh out the story of survival from a kind of a gendered perspective. So they're a very interesting collection as well. But again, these are all accessible via the portal, jumping over to the library, and then hopefully coming to us and being able to view these in our reading room.
So Christine, so thank you. So at the moment, just to make clear, so none of these 101 at the moment, they're not available online. So people have to come to you to the
No,
reading room. And is that
yes,
is that
exactly.
for the future? Is that what you plan to do? So you're not planning any online access? And why not is my question. Or what are your concerns?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So it partly depends on what the agreements were when they weren't recorded by us, what the agreements were in place when these were deposited with us. And then also, as we know, there's a whole variety of kind of legal issues around publishing things online. But there are cases where I think it's possible that some of these have been excerpted and are potentially viewable on our Refugee Maps web resource, where we have mapped out a lot of our family document collections on a map. And it uses the same kind of technology and the same company, UMAP, that the Holocaust UK map uses, that was created by the AJR. And what's interesting about this is that you can sometimes find material that you wouldn't be able to see unless you came on site. So you can get excerpts. So I'm not exactly sure if none of these at all are available. They might be excerpted on the refugee map, which is yet another source.
Yeah.
But hopefully in the future, more of this, because we are undergoing a digital transformation project. We will have a new digital library that launches in 2025. And it's just a lot of working out the technology and the copyright, the intellectual property, all of these legal issues that are around
Yeah.
the deposits of particular collections. Because I think for us, I think the only collection of these that's organically our own is the girls' interview. Interviews. So I think we have to do a bit more research in
Yeah.
terms of what else is possible.
I mean,
But hopefully, we're moving towards more open access to everything. So
because obviously this is a interesting topic, and with the portal, Shaw Foundation has made all their UK interviews available. Refugee Voices, we've
yeah,
made some available. So for me, it's really interesting because I have to admit I am slightly worried about it, although I think it is a wonderful
mm,
resource, and there is the potential for misuse, etc., etc. So I think it will be interesting to see whether one needs to be concerned, or how the resource is going to be used. And hopefully, I mean,
Yes.
from my perspective, some of these, especially the interviews, the 15 interviews with the girls, they are the
Mm,
overlaps with refugee voices, with other institutions. So it would be wonderful if some of them
yes,
maybe could be made available on the portal, because as you said, then you
that
could
would be great. That would
map
be
the
great.
memory, and maybe that's something for you to look into. Of those 15, whether a few of them maybe could be maybe those ones which have been interviewed elsewhere. Um,
Exactly. And I think a lot of those names will be recognized.
yeah,
But maybe that's the place to start. So yeah,
yeah,
that's definitely a continued conversation we should keep having. Yeah.
yeah. And in terms of all these collections, in terms of interview methodology, can you, obviously each project was different, so maybe can you describe, if you've looked across those various projects, what the difference
Mm,
is and how it has developed over time? Because some of them were earlier. For example, I've never heard of the Leo Beck interviews. I'm really curious now, because obviously that's a kind of different project um, within another organization. So just wondered how you can see that development over those 101 interviews.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting because as I mentioned with the Conan interviews, these were taken for a very specific
Yeah.
book project. And so the methodology is almost like an outlier in a way.
Yes.
But it's also very interesting because he is interviewing as a descendant, and because he knows so much about the physical space of Conan and can sort of corroborate memories, and discuss, and sort of prompt further additional discussion of particular aspects of life there. They're quite lively, interactive discussions. Sometimes it's hard because there's interruptions and you have to figure out who's speaking. So that's a kind of sort of an outlier. But the
Yeah, so
others, I
that's not
think,
the
were
oral
taken.
history.
Um, Excuse me. Others were taken more similarly to kind of traditional oral history methods. And the Leo Beck Lodge, I think there are multiple interviewers in that project, um, and from what I can tell, also have German language skills. Maybe we're German native speakers. It would be interesting, I think, to look a little bit more about who those interviewers were and what their relationship to the lodge was. But I think, as far as I could tell, when I looked at these, and I haven't listened to them all, I listened to, be
Yeah,
completely honest.
yeah,
I took a sampling. It sounded like they were women interviewers as well. So also interesting from the gendered perspective about women interviewing other women versus women interviewing men. And then in the last case, we have the Pascal Theater. These were again for a specific project. So maybe this is also slightly outside of the oral history methodology because it was intended to help create this theater production. And so they may not be as expansive in terms of a life history approach that oral histories take. But I think Catherine's, the interviews that she did with the girls are quite expansive and quite kind of traditionally focused in terms of that developing oral history methodology of taking in as much information as possible and letting the interviewees kind of guide the discussion. But of course, she did want to focus on the life after because this is the kind of generative reason for those interviews, and also to kind of correct the idea that it was only male identifying survivors who
yeah.
had come to the UK. So it was also to kind of correct that narrative. So you can see that, you
Mm.
know, that's the kind of basis of that creation. So it is interesting to also map different methodologies and why, and at the library as a repository collecting information that was generated from the research process, you can see how research
Yeah,
questions change, and develop interviews as well. So as opposed to a kind of, this is the end point, is to collect these for evidence or for commemorative purposes. If the end point is a very specific research question, then that shapes how they come together.
yeah. Obviously, the interviews in the research project are different. could be very interesting. I just
Mm,
wondered also whether people then released all these interviews, if it's a conversation, because I had this not problem, but when you kind of just record, and it's of course a messier process, and people say all kinds of things. So I don't know
yes,
how you dealt,
yes.
or how he dealt with the release of those kinds of conversation. I don't know, but
Yeah, it's good. It's interesting if any of them there, we'd have to check if there's any that are particularly embargoed or not. We do have some embargoed interviews,
okay,
which were conducted with former staff members. But those were not meant for the public. So that was really for institutional history purposes. And they are interesting,
okay.
but
So they're
they
not
will,
they're not on the portal.
because we don't have permission. No, they're not on the portal and probably will never be. They are audio interviews. They're very, very
Aha,
interesting,
here's a
but
secret. Here's a
unfortunately,
secret collection. Secret collection.
a secret collection.
So how
But
many are there,
they and
Christine?
they
How many are there
there's
of those?
I want to say it's a good question. There's not that many. Our
Mm,
former head of collections, Kat Hupschman, took these interviews for the most part, and I think they have been excerpted when we had an anniversary exhibition back before I started at the library,
yeah,
and we have sort of published kind of excerpts of them. But there's fewer than 10 for sure,
right.
and I've only listened to about three of them. But I understand why they're embargoed.
But that's really interesting, because this whole issue of institutional history has come up. Because one of the
Yes.
concerns, for example, mentioned by Stephen Naron, is that when you come to a portal and you have online access, you take away the archivist, or the person who's got institutional knowledge. Normally they have to come to the library.
Yes.
So the kind of mediated things comes away, and some knowledge, of course, is lost in that process. So I think it's wonderful that people had the foresight to record people within an institution, and that other people should do the same. I'm quite aware of it. For Refugee Voices, I thought we should, and
Yeah,
we have interviewed, we have done a little bit, but not extensively. I think, every project should really do that today. But,
definitely.
it is interesting, um, how institutional knowledge in a way is lost once it is, you can access an interview even without registering, because our point of the portal was that we make it as easy as possible, and we don't want to lose people, so they have access. I don't know how you feel about that, as as a research library where people really come to you, whether you feel that that loss of knowledge or mediation has
Mm,
is going to have an impact on the researchers and how the interviews are going to be used.
I definitely agree with that and with what Stephen said, because there is a balance. Obviously, the intention is to make things accessible, and then this kind of being able to do it from the comfort of your home or wherever you are, is obviously a huge benefit to most people who want to do this kind of research. But then you're missing out on those conversations with somebody like Howard, my colleague, who's our senior archivist, who's been with the library the longest of our current staff, who has a huge amount of institutional knowledge, and I hope we can interview him at some point too. But there are there is this mediation that's lost, and the conversations that you can have about the context, and it doesn't apply only to testimony collections. It applies
No.
to collections across the board. So, for
Yeah.
example, we have a digital copy of the International Tracing Service archive, and this is now called the Arrowson Archives, and they've done a huge amount of work in terms of making that collection accessible to anybody who wants to research their own family's history. But then questions abound, and where we come in at the library is that we work with people who have often started their own family research and have lots of questions about what does this document mean, even with metadata,
Yeah.
even with a good description, even with a good archival structure. There still needs to be, sometimes for people who are quite new to doing research in archives or how archives and libraries work, to have those
Yeah.
conversations. So I don't think the digital is ever going to replace
No.
people. So I think
It's
hopefully we will still be around to help people.
and people want that connection. People want that connection. I
Yeah,
myself have looked
absolutely.
at our Arlson, and there's a lot of stuff I need to do, and I have not done it yet. And for me, the idea that I can speak to somebody is much easier than just go online and do the research. But it's an interesting thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
But
that's again going back to all of that institutional knowledge that's held by people who do this every day. And we do
yeah,
retain a lot of that. So it is good to have these conversations like we're having now. It's really
yeah.
good.
And the context, I think, you know, in an interview, obviously, you don't know exactly what's happening between a tape change, and you don't know. You said, you have this correspondence for the early 50s for those interviews. So
Mm,
most archives, of course, don't keep this now. The email, for example, there's
right.
sometimes, of course, there is email correspondence before and after the interview. I have email correspondence with my interviews. That's not kept anywhere, or
Yeah.
all kinds of the discussions and team meetings and all that. So I guess some archives have that, but and hopefully for the portal, maybe we can build it up and each institution can give us more information once they have more information or more contextual information. So there's
Yes.
more, uh, about the history. That's why I think we're doing this to kind of understand how each collection came about,
Yes.
within
Yes,
the
exactly.
institution,
Yeah.
that they didn't come out of nowhere. There is a history to that as well.
Right. And they reflect the priorities at the time or the funding that we always can't sort of, forget about the funding that was associated and how that shaped different projects, and things like that. So that institutional history is really important for understanding the context of why these were recorded at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Christine, looking at your collection, is there anything you want to point anyone who might use this portal? I mean, I'm not saying any highlights or anything in particular you want to kind of bring to anyone's attention.
Well, I think it goes back to what we were just saying too about, the kind of balance between the digital and, the access point and the on-site research. We are sort of working more towards this open access to everything and digitizing our materials. And we have this digital transformation project. Our digital library will launch next year. So if you do come through the portal to us, I think I would highlight that this isn't it. There's much more to be accessed, and um, and this kind of co-locating of materials is also, of course, really useful for helping people access. As I said, we have the access point to the AJR refugee voices as well, and so these kind of collections can speak to each other,
Yeah.
and it's not just the one interview. So if you get through to one interview, be sure to keep clicking through and finding more, and hopefully coming to visit us in London if you can.
Mhm. And also the
That's
Wiener.
a kind of that's a kind of broad answer,
Yeah,
but
no, that's a good
that's a
answer.
broad answer to the question. But
You can also add that you have a very, very nice reading room and it's, in a
we
central
do,
location, and it's great to visit
yes,
in any case.
exactly, and it's close to the British Museum, so you can do that on your way
Yeah.
to the British Museum. So yeah, very well located, and yes, very friendly staff. So we will be here to help.
Yeah. No, it also, of course, the Wiener is also part of the Erie portal. So another portal which is
Yes,
not an audiovisual portal, but for all kinds. So the idea of a sort of network
exactly.
portal is nothing new. I think it is new for audiovisual for testimonies, as far as I know, to that extent
I
that you
think
have
so.
really online access. So that's why I'm excited about it. But there are other portals and the idea is the same, isn't it?
Exactly, to bring these collections together and unify them in a way that makes it easier for people to wayfind. Because, like I said, for people who are not necessarily accustomed to having to search across hundreds of different repositories to find something, it's one step towards making that easier. It still means that you might have to go to different locations and
Yeah.
contact different institutions for permissions and things like that. But at least it helps people find, and that's something that the Erie portal does very well. I think it's, even if like it kind of comes up very quickly on a Google search. So if you're looking for a particular document, and then you click into Erie, and then it takes you to its home, to the document's home institution. So I think, portals like the testimony portal can really help ease people's wayfinding when they're trying to do research or look at their family's history and find other people who had similar experiences that might shed light on somebody they don't know very much about. That's another aspect of our work that I think these digital portals really help facilitate, because it's not only academic researchers, it's people who are researching their own families and trying to understand what their families might have experienced.
Yeah. No, and I think it's right, because the idea of a portal, of this portal, the Holocaust Testimony UK, is, of course, you can search it in all kinds of ways, but you can also just get into interviews without searching anything. You can just listen and
Right.
find your way around that way. And I think that's important, that it's not only for the researchers looking for something specific, but it's also for the general public who just, is going to a site and sees of course, there's a lot of material, but can just listen in and then find their way around that. But what I was going to say is,
Yes.
for the Wiener, what's of course interesting is that if somebody listens to a testimony, they might then come to you and to the e-portal and find there is other material of a person in your collection. And that's, of course, another
Exactly.
very important
Or
way
in other collections. Yeah.
of cross-referencing. So, for example, I'm thinking of Anne Kirk,
Yeah.
who was interviewed
Hmm.
for Refugee Voices. I think she was also interviewed for other projects. Anyway, you've got a lot of her papers. So that's a
Yes.
wonderful thing for a researcher, that to have that available.
Absolutely. And that's what a portal like this can help facilitate. Clicking over into our catalog and then remembering to keep searching, because you just never know, you'll find more information.
Yeah. Okay, so let's hope there's more traffic coming to you and more visitors coming to the library or asking for some
Yes.
digital access. And as I said, it would be wonderful if we could have some of those girls, especially the girls' interviews, because I
Yeah. Let's
looked
keep talking
yesterday,
about that for sure.
and that would be really wonderful.
Mm,
Okay, so
that's a good point. And then wishing you all every success on the portal, because it looks fantastic, and really excited to see it launched very soon.
thank you, Christine. Now, very exciting, and I have to say, sometimes, when I'm just testing it, I'm testing it still, and it is amazing. I'm just amazed sometimes how you can cross-reference and find things quickly. As an oral historian, I think it's
Yes.
going to be
Yes.
so interesting. What kind of research can emerge from this because of the.
Mm,
I'm not saying it couldn't have happened earlier, and it has happened, but the ease of access, just changes, I think, changes changes things for the researcher.
def-
Yeah. Anyway, thank you, Christine. Is there
definitely.
anything
It makes it much easier.
I
Thank you
have
so
asked
much.
you, you want to add? Is there anything else?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered everything.
Okay. So thank you, Christine, for this conversation. And if people
Thank
want to
you.
know more, they should go to the portal. They can go to the partner page and just look, if they want to, they can just look at your interviews, and then they can look at the person and can find whether they have been interviewed elsewhere. So thank you so much.